I never thought one simple phone call could turn my whole world upside down. It was late in the afternoon, and I was still at my small desk, staring at numbers that didn't add up, bills piled higher than I wanted to admit. My life felt ordinary, almost invisible, like the kind of existence no one would ever write a story about. And then, out of nowhere, I was invited into a world I didn't belong to, a world where money wasn't a dream but a weapon, a world where people like me were never expected to walk. It began when a man, powerful, calm, and strangely direct, asked me to do something I never imagined. He asked me to date his son. The word millionaire was enough to make my chest tighten. People like him never even looked at people like me. I was a name on a forgotten list, a face lost in the crowd, just another young man trying to figure out who he was without getting crushed by the weight of expectations. But he wasn't looking at me like I was nothing. His voice carried weight, as if he was already sure I would say yes. He made it sound so simple, like asking someone to pick up groceries, as though feelings could be arranged like a business deal. I didn't even know how to breathe in that moment. Who makes a request like that? Who tells a stranger, "Date my son"? At first I thought it was a joke, maybe some cruel prank to laugh at later. But then I met him, the man himself. He carried the kind of presence that filled an entire room, dressed in a suit that looked like it had been tailored by destiny itself. His eyes were sharp, but there was something tired in them too, like a man who had everything but slept with empty arms. He studied me as if I was an investment, weighing my worth without asking who I really was. And yet, when he spoke, there was something in his tone I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just money talking, it was something closer to desperation, though he masked it well. I remember nodding along, not because I agreed, but because I couldn't find the courage to say no. Deep inside me, 100 questions screamed for answers. Why me? What did he expect? What kind of father offers a stranger the chance to step into his son's heart like it's a vacant apartment for rent? I wanted to run, but curiosity held me in place. There was something intoxicating about the way he spoke, as if he knew secrets about me I hadn't discovered myself. I left that meeting with my pulse racing, head full of confusion, but one thought burned hotter than the rest. I was about to meet his son. The weight of that reality pressed against my chest all night. What kind of person would he be? Spoiled? Cold? Arrogant, like someone born into wealth and taught the world would bend for him? Or maybe broken, trapped under the shadow of a father who wanted to control even his heart? I tossed and turned, not knowing if I should feel nervous, excited, or guilty. I didn't ask for this. I didn't dream of walking into someone else's life like this. And yet, here I was, standing at the edge of something bigger than I had ever known. The day came faster than I wanted. I found myself in a mansion so large it felt like a city, marble floors reflecting my hesitant steps, chandeliers glowing like captured stars above me. Everything smelled expensive, polished, almost untouchable. I felt like an intruder, like a stain that didn't belong in such perfection. My throat tightened as I waited in the vast living room, pretending to admire paintings I couldn't understand. I kept hearing footsteps somewhere in the distance, light, unhurried, and then finally he appeared. His son. He wasn't what I expected. He didn't carry himself with arrogance, and his expression wasn't spoiled or demanding. Instead, he looked almost shy, as though he, too, felt out of place in his own house. His eyes found mine, and in that instant, the air between us shifted. I felt something, faint but undeniable, like the spark of a match in the dark. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My chest tightened in ways I didn't want to explain, not even to myself. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something I hadn't felt in years, a pull, a question, a dangerous curiosity. We sat across from each other, fumbling through words that felt too heavy for such a delicate moment. I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching us, not with cruelty, but with calculation. His father's shadow hung over everything, and the truth of why I was there pulsed like a secret between us. I told myself not to feel anything, not to let the trap close around me, but with every second that passed, my heart betrayed me. It whispered that this might not be just a deal. This might be the beginning of something that could either save me or break me forever. I couldn't stop thinking about that first meeting. His eyes had followed me into my dreams, soft and uncertain, the kind of eyes that didn't match the world he lived in. I woke up restless, lying in my bed with the ceiling staring back at me, wondering why my chest felt tight. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I had walked into that house because of his father's request, not because of him. Yet there I was, replaying every word, every glance, every small silence that stretched between us like an invisible thread. It terrified me to admit that I wanted to see him again, not because I had to, but because something in me longed for it. Still, doubt ate at me. What was I doing? Was I just a pawn in a game I didn't understand? His father had money, power, and control. He could arrange people's lives like chess pieces, and maybe I was just another move. I didn't like the idea of being bought, of being placed into someone else's story without my choice. But at the same time, there was a spark in me that I couldn't deny. It felt reckless, dangerous, but also alive. I had been stuck in a routine for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to feel pulled towards someone. That day, I found myself back at the mansion. I told myself it was just to be polite, to show that I wasn't ignoring the invitation. Deep down, I knew it was more than that. When I stepped inside, I saw him again, sitting near the window this time, the sunlight softening his face. He looked different than the polished image I had built in my head. He wasn't dressed to impress, just in simple clothes, like he wanted to disappear into normalcy. For a moment, I saw not the son of a millionaire, but just a young man who might have been as lost as I was. We exchanged greetings, quiet and almost awkward, and then the silence stretched again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, yes, but in a way that made me curious. His voice finally broke the quiet, and it was softer than I expected. He didn't ask about me like his father had, with sharpness and suspicion. Instead, he asked simple things, where I grew up, what I liked to do, what made me happy. No one had asked me questions like that in a long time. And I realized he wasn't just talking to fill the space. He was actually listening. That's what disarmed me. He listened like my answers mattered. It unsettled me, because I didn't know how to handle that kind of attention. I found myself telling him little details I usually kept to myself, about my small apartment, about how I liked to read but could never afford the books I wanted, about the way the city lights always made me feel both lonely and comforted. He smiled, not out of politeness, but because he understood. That smile did something to me I wasn't prepared for. It slipped past all the walls I had built around my heart and left me exposed. Time moved differently with him. Hours felt like minutes, and before I knew it, the sun was slipping low, painting the room in golden shadows. I should have left. I should have reminded myself that this wasn't real, that I had been asked to be there, not chosen by fate. But my body refused to move. I wanted to stay in that moment, in that fragile bubble where the world outside didn't exist. I saw the weight he carried in his shoulders, the way his laugh sounded almost rare, like a secret treasure. He wasn't spoiled. He wasn't arrogant. He was human, fragile in ways I hadn't expected. And that made me ache, because it made me see him not as his father's son, but as someone I could care for if I wasn't careful. But just as the warmth between us began to feel safe, I remembered where I was. The house wasn't ours. The moment wasn't private. Somewhere, his father was close, maybe watching, maybe listening, maybe waiting for us to cross a line. That thought chilled me, even as I caught myself leaning in closer, as though some invisible magnet pulled us together. I left that evening torn apart inside. My heart was already betraying me, whispering that I wanted to see him again, that I wanted to know the sound of his laughter better, that I wanted to learn the story hidden behind his careful smile. But the rational part of me screamed that it was a trap. That love couldn't grow under someone else's command. That whatever I was feeling, it wasn't safe. And yet, the moment I walked out of that mansion, I already knew the truth. No matter how hard I tried, I was going to see him again. Because something had begun between us, something too strong to silence, even if it cost me more than I was ready to lose. The next time I saw him, the air between us felt different, heavier, charged with something neither of us had words for. I told myself it was just another visit, nothing more than a polite continuation of what had already started, but my chest betrayed me the moment I stepped through the door. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and my hands wouldn't stay still. He was waiting for me again, but this time he wasn't sitting by the window. He was standing in the middle of the room, like he had been pacing before I arrived, as though he too had been caught in this strange restlessness. When his eyes met mine, there was a flicker, a pause that lasted just a second too long, and in that second, I understood that he was just as uncertain as I was. We began talking, slowly at first, about nothing important, the weather, the books on the shelf, the city outside the gates. But each word seemed to carry more weight than it should have. It was as if every casual remark was hiding something deeper, something neither of us dared to say outright. He asked me if I had ever felt out of place, like the world expected you to be someone you couldn't recognize. The question startled me, not because it was unusual, but because it was so raw, so close to the thoughts I often kept buried. I admitted that I often felt invisible, like I was walking through life unnoticed, trying to matter in a world that didn't care. His face softened at my words, and for the first time I saw the loneliness behind his carefully calm expression. It was strange, how quickly we understood each other without needing to explain everything. In that mansion, surrounded by wealth and power, he still looked like someone searching for a place where he belonged, someone who didn't feel at home in his own skin. And it made me realize that maybe the distance between our worlds wasn't as wide as I thought. We moved closer without meaning to. Our chairs, once separated by polite space, shifted as if the universe itself was shrinking the distance between us. He told me stories from his childhood, about how the house felt like a golden cage, filled with beauty but empty of freedom. I listened to him speak about his father's expectations, the constant pressure to be perfect, to fit into an image that never felt like his own reflection. There was a tremor in his voice, the kind that comes from years of carrying unspoken pain. I wanted to reach out, to place my hand on his, but I held back, afraid of crossing a line too soon. Still, the silence that followed was thick with everything we didn't dare to say. At one point, he laughed softly, almost shyly, when I told him about my clumsy attempt to cook for myself the week before and how the smoke alarm had nearly woken the entire building. His laughter wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was real, unguarded, the kind of sound that makes you want to hear it again and again. It lit something inside me, something fragile but alive. And in that moment, I realized how dangerous this was becoming. I wasn't supposed to care. I wasn't supposed to look at him like this. Yet I couldn't stop. His eyes would linger on mine, and I could feel the pull, that invisible thread tightening between us. My heart betrayed me with every beat, reminding me that this was no longer a simple arrangement or a polite meeting. It was becoming something else, something deeper, something terrifying in its intensity. The sun began to set, spilling soft light across the room, and it felt like the world had slowed just for us. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was heavy with anticipation, with the kind of tension that makes you forget to breathe. I wanted to speak, to break it, but my voice wouldn't come. All I could do was watch him, memorize the curve of his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to hold secrets too heavy for one person to bear. And then it happened. Not a kiss, not yet, but something almost more dangerous. His hand brushed against mine, just lightly, almost by accident, but the spark that shot through me was undeniable. My fingers froze, and so did his, neither of us pulling away, both of us pretending it hadn't happened while knowing it had changed everything. I left that night with my chest aching, torn between fear and hope, between reason and something far stronger. I told myself to be careful, to protect my heart, but deep inside I knew it was already too late. Something had begun that neither of us could stop, no matter how hard we tried. And though I walked out of that house into the cool night air, I carried his touch with me, a ghost on my skin that refused to fade. The days that followed felt like I was living two lives. On the outside, nothing had changed. I still walked the same streets, still came home to the same small apartment with peeling paint on the walls and the same stack of unpaid bills waiting on the table. But inside, everything was shifting. My thoughts refused to let go of him, replaying his voice, his laugh, the way his hand had brushed against mine like an accident that was anything but. I caught myself smiling at nothing in the middle of the day, then just as quickly scolding myself for being foolish. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. I wasn't supposed to let someone into the guarded corners of my heart. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, looking at me as though I was more than a stranger, more than a passing guest in his father's world. When I went back to the mansion, something was different. The moment I walked in, I could sense it. The air felt heavier, as if it remembered the touch we shared, as if the walls themselves were witnesses to something delicate blooming between us. He was waiting again, and this time, there was no careful distance. He greeted me with a smile that wasn't forced or polite but warm, almost relieved. It was the kind of smile that pulled me in before I even had the chance to stop myself. We sat down, but the conversation moved differently now. The small talk faded quickly, replaced by truths we hadn't dared to share before. He told me about the loneliness that came with being surrounded by everything money could buy, yet never being able to choose what truly mattered. His words trembled at times, breaking into silences that said more than his sentences ever could. I listened closely, not out of obligation but because I wanted to understand him, wanted to carry some of that weight with him. And when it was my turn, I found myself telling him about my own battles, the quiet nights where I felt like the world had forgotten me, the way I often questioned if I would ever find a place where I belonged. My voice shook, but I didn't hide it, because with him, I didn't feel the need to. He looked at me in a way that made me feel seen, truly seen, like my struggles weren't just invisible burdens but stories worth holding. Hours slipped away without us noticing. We wandered from one topic to another, each confession tying us closer, each shared silence deepening the connection between us. At one point, he leaned back, gazing out the window with a faraway look, and said he often imagined running away, disappearing into a life where no one knew his name, where he wasn't defined by his father's shadow. I watched him, my heart aching, because I wanted to tell him I understood. I wanted to tell him that maybe he didn't have to run if he found someone who saw him for who he was, not for what was expected of him. But the words stayed trapped on my tongue, too dangerous to release. Instead, I asked him what he would do if he ever got the chance. His eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. He talked about traveling, about simple moments like walking in crowded streets without anyone recognizing him, about sitting in cafes and watching the world go by without judgment. It was strange and beautiful to hear someone who had everything describe the things I took for granted as if they were priceless treasures. And in that moment, I realized how different we were, yet how closely our hearts beat to the same rhythm. As the day faded into evening, our closeness grew. This time, we didn't sit on opposite sides of the room. Our chairs were side by side, the space between us shrinking with every word, every look. When our hands touched again, it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, quiet, and full of unspoken meaning. My fingers trembled as his rested against mine, and neither of us moved away. The silence that followed was loud in its own way, filled with emotions neither of us dared to name yet. My chest was a storm, torn between fear of what this meant and the undeniable truth that I didn't want to let go. I didn't care if it was reckless, if it was fragile, if it was dangerous. For the first time in a long while, I felt alive. That night, when I finally left the mansion, the world outside looked different. The streets were the same, the city lights flickered as they always did, but I carried something with me I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the memory of his hand in mine, it was the feeling that something real was beginning, something I hadn't planned for but couldn't turn away from. And even though I knew the risks, even though his father's presence loomed like a shadow behind every moment we shared, I couldn't help but hope. Because for the first time, hope didn't feel like a cruel trick. It felt like the beginning of something I wanted to fight for, no matter the cost. The moment I walked into the mansion that day, I could sense that the air was different. It wasn't the kind of difference you could point at, not a piece of furniture moved or a new painting on the wall, but something heavier, something alive, pressing against my chest as soon as I crossed the threshold. My steps echoed more sharply, my pulse too fast for the calm silence of the house. I found him in the garden this time, sitting on a stone bench under a canopy of vines, the sunlight flickering through the leaves and catching in his hair. He looked up at me with that same soft expression, a mixture of shyness and something deeper, something that kept pulling me back no matter how much I told myself to resist. For a while, neither of us spoke. I sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence, but still leaving the space between us as if that distance could keep us safe from what was already burning inside. He finally broke the silence, his voice quiet, telling me how he often came to this garden to escape the walls of the mansion, to breathe air that didn't taste like expectations. I listened, but I couldn't focus on his words alone. I was distracted by the way his lips moved, by the way his fingers tapped nervously against the stone, by the way his eyes kept flickering toward me and then away, as if he was carrying the same storm I was. My chest was tight. My mind kept whispering warnings, but my body betrayed me, leaning closer without me realizing it. When his hand brushed mine, this time neither of us pretended it was an accident. My fingers hesitated, trembling, before curling slowly into his. The warmth of his skin against mine was enough to silence every doubt for just a moment. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. The world around us seemed to fall into silence, as if even the birds and the wind knew to leave us alone in that fragile moment. I turned my head to look at him, and he was already looking at me. His eyes searched mine, asking a question neither of us could voice. I could feel my breath catch, feel the racing beat of my heart pressing against the edges of my chest. And then, without planning it, without giving myself time to think, I leaned in. The kiss was hesitant, soft, almost trembling. It wasn't polished or perfect, it was real, raw, and filled with everything we hadn't dared to say. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world had collapsed into just that one point of contact, his lips against mine, the warmth of his hand holding mine tighter, the electricity that surged through me with terrifying clarity. It was nothing like I imagined. It was more. It was frightening and intoxicating at once, as if I had stepped off a cliff but discovered wings I never knew I had. When we pulled apart, the silence was deafening. He looked down quickly, as though afraid of what he had just done, but his hand didn't let go of mine. My chest ached with a mixture of joy and fear. What had we just started? What had we crossed into that we could never return from? I wanted to tell him how it felt, how it shattered the walls I had built around myself, how it made me want to hold on no matter the consequences. But the words wouldn't come. They were too heavy, too dangerous. We sat there for a long time, hands still linked, hearts still racing, pretending to admire the garden while both of us knew we were replaying that kiss over and over again in our heads. When I finally stood to leave, he looked up at me with eyes that said everything we couldn't put into words. I carried that look with me as I walked out of the mansion, past the empty halls and heavy silence, back into the world that suddenly felt less lonely, less gray. My lips still burned with the memory, and my heart knew something it couldn't deny anymore. This wasn't just a request from his father, and it wasn't just curiosity pulling us together. Something real had taken root, something fragile but unshakable. And as terrifying as it was, I wanted it. I wanted him. Even if it meant stepping into a fire I might never escape. The days after that kiss were nothing like the days before it. Everything had changed, though on the surface we pretended nothing had. I still arrived at the mansion like I always did, walking through the echoing halls with their polished floors and grand silence, but now there was a secret burning between us. A secret that made every glance linger longer than it should, every word tremble with unspoken meaning. My heart carried the memory of his lips like a fire I couldn't put out, and each time I saw him, that fire grew stronger, hotter, almost unbearable. Yet beneath the warmth of what we had shared, a darker shadow began to creep in. I could feel it, like a weight pressing against us even when no one else was in the room. His father's presence was everywhere, not in body but in the way the walls seemed to listen, in the way the silence of that house was too sharp, too careful. I couldn't shake the feeling that our stolen moments weren't as hidden as we wanted them to be. That fear wrapped itself around me one afternoon when I noticed the way his father looked at us. He entered the room suddenly, his steps quiet, his gaze sharp, and though he said nothing more than a polite greeting, I saw the flicker in his eyes. It wasn't anger, not yet, but it was suspicion, a careful measuring of the distance between his son and me. My chest tightened as I forced myself to smile, to speak lightly, but the air felt heavy with things unsaid. Later, when we were alone, he confessed that his father had always been watching, always pulling strings behind the scenes. He said it with a weariness that broke my heart, as though being observed was nothing new, as though his entire life had been a stage where he was only allowed to play the role his father chose for him. He tried to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in his voice when he whispered that this was different, that what was happening between us wasn't something he could bear to see destroyed. I wanted to be strong for him, to tell him we could keep this hidden, that love could survive in shadows, but even as I said it, a part of me knew it was a fragile promise. Secrets have a way of slipping through cracks, and ours was growing too big to hide forever. Still, the pull between us was stronger than fear. Each time I looked at him, the rest of the world faded away, and I couldn't help myself. I reached for his hand when I shouldn't have. I let my eyes linger on him when I knew someone could walk in at any moment. I let my heart betray me over and over again because the thought of holding back was worse than the risk of being caught. And then, one evening, as the last light of the sun slipped through the tall windows, it happened again. We were sitting closer than we should have been, our voices low, our laughter soft, when he leaned toward me, and I didn't resist. The kiss was deeper this time, no longer hesitant but filled with all the longing we had been trying to hide. My hands trembled as they cupped his face, and for a few breathless moments, I let myself forget everything but the taste of him, the warmth of him, the truth of what I wanted. But then the sound of footsteps shattered the moment. We pulled apart too quickly, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding as though we had been caught in the act of some crime. And there, at the edge of the room, stood his father. His expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp and unblinking, watching us in silence. He didn't speak, not at first, and the quiet was worse than any words could have been. It stretched between us like a blade, cutting through the fragile hope we had been clinging to. My chest went cold, my hands still trembling from the kiss, my mind screaming that everything was about to collapse. He finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy with something I couldn't name. He didn't shout, didn't rage, didn't accuse. Instead, he simply observed, as though he had been expecting this, as though we had stepped into a story he had already written for us. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, but even as fear coiled in my stomach, I felt his hand tighten around mine, refusing to let go. In that moment, I understood that whatever came next, we were no longer standing alone. We were in this together, even if the whole world was watching. The silence that followed his father's sudden appearance was heavier than any shout could have been. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not only from the kiss we had just shared but from the weight of knowing we had been seen, that the secret we thought was ours had finally slipped into the open. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't bring myself to let go of his hand, even though every instinct screamed that this was dangerous. His father's eyes were cold but unreadable, fixed on us as though he was dissecting every detail, every movement, every flicker of emotion that passed between us. When he finally spoke, His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides storms beneath the surface. He asked me to leave. Not with anger, not with force, but with a tone that made it clear he was no longer speaking as the man who had first invited me into this house, but as someone who now saw me as a trespasser. I wanted to protest, wanted to explain, but the words died in my throat. His son tightened his grip on my hand, refusing to let me go, and for the first time I saw defiance in him, raw and unshaken. He looked at his father with steady eyes and said no, a word so small yet so powerful in that room full of unspoken rules. It was the first time I realized how much strength he had been hiding beneath his quietness, how much weight he carried every day by submitting to expectations he never wanted. That single word cracked something open, not just in the air between them, but in me too. The conversation that followed was sharp and painful. His father demanded to know what we thought we were doing, whether we had any idea of the consequences, of how the world outside these walls would see us. He spoke of family reputation, of legacy, of everything money could protect but also everything it could destroy. His son's voice shook, but he didn't back down. He said he was tired of living a life that wasn't his, tired of being a reflection of his father's ambitions instead of a person with his own heart. His words were quiet, but they cut deeper than any shout could. Watching him stand there, refusing to be broken, filled me with a mix of pride and fear. Pride, because I could see the man he truly was, no longer hidden in shadows. Fear, because I knew what it meant to go against someone who had built his entire life on control. I stood silently, caught between them, every muscle in my body tense. Part of me wanted to step in, to defend him, to shout that love wasn't a transaction or a shame to be hidden. But I knew this wasn't my battle alone. This was his moment, his choice to fight for himself, and all I could do was stand by him and refuse to let go of his hand. The argument stretched on, each side unwilling to surrender. His father's face grew harder, his words sharper, but his son never wavered. At last, the older man turned away, his silence louder than any ending statement could have been, leaving the room with the kind of stillness that made it clear nothing would ever be the same again. When the door closed, the weight of it hit me. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, but his hand was still in mine, his eyes still locked on me with a look that said more than words ever could. He was scared, I could see it in the trembling of his jaw, the way his shoulders shook, but beneath the fear was something stronger, something determined. We sat together in that silence, knowing the path ahead wouldn't be easy, that the world outside those walls was full of judgment, that even inside this house we were no longer safe. But in that same silence, I also knew one thing with unshakable certainty. We had chosen each other. And no matter how much it cost, no matter what battles waited for us next, neither of us was willing to walk away. The night after his father walked out of that room, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling as my mind played back every detail of what had happened. His hand in mine, his father's eyes burning through us, the defiance in his voice when he refused to let go. It replayed over and over, and with each replay, my chest tightened with fear and pride all at once. Fear, because I knew the kind of man his father was, powerful and unrelenting, the kind of man who could crush lives without raising his voice. Pride, because I had seen him, truly seen him, stand up for himself, for us, even when his voice shook. By morning, I knew I couldn't walk away. I couldn't pretend this was too much or too dangerous. He was already in me now, in every thought, every beat of my heart, and leaving would mean betraying both him and myself. When I arrived at the mansion the next day, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. The staff looked at me differently, their eyes darting away as though they knew, as though the walls themselves had whispered the truth of what had happened. My chest tightened, but I walked on, because no look, no silence, was going to keep me from him. I found him in the same garden where we had first kissed, sitting quietly on the stone bench with his hands folded, staring down at the ground as though he was carrying the weight of the whole house on his shoulders. When he looked up and saw me, the heaviness in his expression softened, and the relief in his eyes made my throat ache. I sat beside him without a word, and for a while, we just existed in that silence together. Eventually, he spoke, his voice quiet, admitting that his father hadn't said much since the night before. He was afraid of what silence meant, afraid of what plans might be forming behind closed doors. But then he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said he didn't care anymore. He said he was done living in fear, done bending under expectations that never belonged to him. He said if choosing me meant losing everything else, then he was ready to pay that price. His words left me speechless. I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have to give up his world for me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Deep down, I knew he wasn't really giving it up. He was freeing himself from a cage he had been trapped in his whole life. And maybe I wasn't saving him. Maybe he was saving himself, and I was just the reason he finally had the courage to do it. That realization filled me with something bigger than fear, bigger than doubt. It filled me with love, not the kind you read about in stories, polished and perfect, but the kind that's messy and terrifying, the kind that makes you want to fight even when you're outnumbered. That evening, we stood together in the garden as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire. He took my hand in his, and for the first time, neither of us cared who might be watching. We kissed again, not hidden in the shadows, not hurried or hesitant, but fully, deeply, like two people who had chosen each other and didn't care who knew. I felt his hand tremble in mine, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the release of years of silence, years of pretending. It was the tremble of freedom. When we pulled apart, I looked into his eyes and knew that whatever battles lay ahead, this was worth it. He was worth it. We were worth it. And maybe the world wouldn't understand, maybe his father would never accept it, maybe people would talk and judge and try to tear us down. But in that moment, surrounded by fading light and the quiet hum of the world, none of it mattered. What mattered was that for the first time in a long time, we were both exactly where we wanted to be. I left the mansion that night with his kiss still on my lips and his words still echoing in my chest. The city around me looked different, brighter, as if something inside me had shifted the way I saw everything. For so long, I had been invisible, moving quietly through life, unnoticed. But now I carried something undeniable, a love that made me visible, a love that made me brave, a love that made me want to fight for tomorrow instead of just survive today. And as I walked home under the glow of the streetlights, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. This was the beginning. A beginning I had never dared to hope for, but one I was ready to live, no matter what it cost.